So if I came up to you and asked you, why are you a Christian? What would you say? How would you respond? Would you stutter? Would you say as your first word? What would you say? I think that's a question that we all need to ask ourselves, because you might be asked that someday. Your child might ask you, your neighbor might ask you, a family member. But beyond just needing to have a defense, beyond just needing to have an answer, why are you a Christian? Why have you continued to be a Christian? Because we are building our life on a pretty fantastic claim. We are building our life. We have reordered our entire life. We could be living vastly different lives right now. We could be on the beach right now, every day, all day, soaking up the sun. But we have reordered our life on the claim that a man who lived 2,000 years ago, who was executed as a criminal, is not only alive today, but is reigning as king over this entire world. Whether you're a believer or not, that's quite a claim. I mean, that is like the claim of all claims to make. So if somebody came up to you and said, why would you believe that? What kind of answer would you give? Look at what 1 Peter says in chapter 3, verse 15. But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with hollering and loudness. No, do it with gentleness and respect. So if somebody comes up and says, why are you a Christian? Can you just say, because? Are you allowed to say that? No. You got to give more than that. So we're going to look at that today. We're going to start looking at some of the reasons. And I do want to give a disclaimer. Nothing I'm going to say today is anything that I came up with on my own. It is all borrowed material that's out there. It's all because people have been researching the life of Jesus from the very beginning. And so we have the blessing to be able to learn from their hard work and their research, the work that other people have done. And we're going to be blessed by that. But my goal, and I think your goal, is to constantly learn, is to constantly grow. Because we all know that we get one shot. We get one life before the judgment day. And so I don't want my life to be built on a lie. I want my life to be built on truth. And so I want to know for certain, did Jesus rise from the dead? Because that's really what it hinges on. Did Jesus rise from the dead? You may not know this or not, but it really isn't debated whether Jesus was a real person. People, 100, 200 years ago maybe questioned that. But today, nobody really questions that. Not even atheists question whether or not Jesus was a real person. It is pretty much accepted, even by the most skeptical historians, that Jesus lived, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, who we know was governor of Judea from the year 26 through 36. So a pretty short window. Those are facts that are not even disputed anymore. But it really comes down to, did Jesus rise from the dead? So if you're talking with someone who's skeptical, they might ask you, can you prove it? Can you prove that Jesus rose from the dead? Well, I would say, well, let's talk about proof for a second. What do we mean? If we're trying to prove something, what does that look like? Because this is not a mathematical formula. This is not a geography question or a chemistry formula where there's a solution that can be determined and repeated over and over again to verify whether it's accurate. We're talking about people who claimed that something happened in history, that on a particular day, he was crucified, and 3 days later, he rose from the dead. So this is an appeal to history. We're looking at this as a historical event. So I would ask the question, can you prove that Tiberius Caesar was a real person? Could you prove that? Well, if you wanted to prove it, how would you do that? How would you go about doing that? Well, you would have to look at the eyewitness testimony, wouldn't you? You would have to look at the sources, the people who wrote about Tiberius, to verify whether he was a real person or not. And we still depend on eyewitness testimony today, don't we? In our courts, sometimes there's DNA evidence, but most of the time, a jury comes to a conviction of beyond a reasonable doubt, or they don't, based on the testimony of eyewitnesses. So we still do that today. And if believe this or not, there is more evidence for the resurrection of Jesus than there is for Tiberius Caesar, who was the Roman emperor during the time of Jesus. So there's more testimony, eyewitness testimony about Jesus than there is about Caesar during this time. So the issue isn't a lack of evidence. The issue is that Christians are just making this claim that an event happened that's never happened before and has never happened since. And that's really what the issue is it's so difficult. It is such beyond people's comprehension that something like that could actually happen in history. Now, if you're being a little smart aleck and being a little nitpicky, you might say, well, what about Lazarus, right? Because Lazarus was raised from the dead. Well, Lazarus is in a different category than Jesus. If you want to talk theologically, Lazarus was more of a resuscitation than resurrection. They're actually different categories. So resurrection involves a transformation from mortality to immortality. So that's why Jesus is alive and can never die again, whereas Lazarus presumably died again. So they're actually different categories. So just wanted to do a little tangent there for us Bible nerds. Now, if you're talking with somebody about Jesus and they don't even believe in God, then nothing you can say about Jesus is probably going to matter to them. Nothing that we're going to talk about today is probably going to make a dent, because if they don't believe in God at all, they're not going to believe in Jesus. So you have to start with, is there a creator? Is there a creator God? That's where you have to start with somebody if you're having a question, is there a God? There's a great Christian scientist, his name is Stephen Meyer, who's doing a lot of work on the evidence of intelligent design. So if you want to do any research on that, he's got a lot of great stuff on that. His name is Stephen Meyer. But if you already believe in God, if you believe that there is a creator who made all of this out of nothing, God who took dust from the ground and breathed life into it and created us in his image, how hard is it then to believe that same God could bring someone back to life? Really, if you think about it, creation is the most incredible miracle to believe. So if you believe in that, I think comparatively, it's not difficult for God to raise Jesus from the dead compared to creation itself. So if you're talking with somebody who they're like, I believe in God, I just can't believe God raised Jesus from the dead. It's like, well, you believe in creation, so that is just a small step to go from creation to resurrection. Now, if someone asks you, why do you believe? And your response is, because the Bible says so. Is that a wrong answer? No, that is not a wrong answer. But if you're talking to somebody who is not a Christian, do they consider the Bible to be the Word of God? No, they don't. They don't consider the Bible. Now, if you're talking to us Christians, the Bible carries all the authority. But if you're talking to someone who's not a believer, that if you say because the Bible says so, that's not going to hold a lot of weight for them. So we're going to be a little bit more specific than that. What we're going to say is, we believe in the resurrection of Jesus because of the eyewitness testimony that has been recorded. So we have the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We've got the writings of Paul. We've got then the writings of the other apostles. Now, we know that Matthew and John were both eyewitnesses. But what about Mark and Luke? Mark wrote down the first-hand stories from Peter, the Apostle Peter, who was one of the greatest witnesses of all time. Mark, the historical writings later said that Mark was with Peter in Rome, and the church there asked Mark to write down every story that Peter had told. Maybe not literally every, but all the important stories that Peter had told about Jesus. In fact, Mark is considered by most people the first gospel to be written, but it wasn't called Mark early on. Early on, it was called the Memoirs of Peter. That's how it was known by. Now, Mark actually might be a eyewitness, though. There is this really strange story about an unnamed young man in the Garden of Gethsemane who has to run away in unflattering circumstances. And none of the other gospel writers talk about him, but Mark does. So he's like, was that you, Mark? I don't know. That's just speculation. But Mark might have been a witness. But if not, he wrote down the everything that Peter taught, everything that Peter told. Now, what about Luke? Luke is very honest. Luke says, I did the investigations. I went to the people who saw Jesus, who spent time with Jesus. I went to them. I interviewed them. I did the work of investigating. He's like, well, why would you go through all that trouble, Luke? He says, because I want to know for certain. I want to know for certain. And you might ask, well, Luke, is it okay just to have a blind faith? And Luke would say, no, you got to know for certain that these things really happened, that Jesus really rose from the dead. And you might ask, well, why do you have to know with that degree of certainty? And for us, it might be difficult to understand, but put yourself back in the first century as a Christian. Life was awful for them. It was true. For many of them, it was truly awful. It was full of hardship. It was full of suffering. And if you had to pick, if you're living in the first century and you could pick the life with the most money, a life with the easiest life, most enjoyable life, you would not pick Christianity. You would not pick it. You would pick something else. And so, you look at what Paul writes in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, because some of the Corinthians, they had a lot of problems. And some of the people there were like, well, maybe Jesus didn't really rise from the dead. Maybe it's just a metaphor. And Peter's like, guys, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, what are we doing? We're wasting our lives. We're wasting our time. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, are you kidding me? It's like, Paul says, do you know how many people have tried to murder me? Do you know how many times I've been beaten, senseless? I have been on the run in danger pretty much constantly. I have gone days without food. I've gone nights without sleeping. And you're telling me maybe he didn't really rise from the dead? No. The only reason I'm doing this is because I saw him alive. I saw him resurrected from the dead. That's the only reason I'm doing all of this. Otherwise, it makes no sense. Otherwise, it's pointless. But Paul says, I saw him alive. And that changes everything. That means it's worth, everything that I've gone through makes it worth it. And you think about believers today. If you live in Nigeria, do you want to know with certainty that Jesus is Lord? Yeah. India, I don't know if you heard the news, but last month, India, they outlawed Christianity, where if you're a Christian, you're going to lose everything by law in India. So you think if you're a Christian in India right now, do you want to know with certainty that Jesus is Lord, that Jesus is alive? Yes, you do. If you're in China, in the Middle East, other countries, it's not just, this is life and death for people even today. So yes, you want to know. You don't want to have doubts. It's not a blind faith. It is a faith built on the eyewitness testimony of those who were there. So how are the claims of the resurrection of Jesus, how are they different than some of the other claims that are out there in the world? Because we all know there's different religions out there. There's other philosophies out there. What makes Christianity, what makes the claims a little bit different? Well, if you think about some of those other religions, how many witnesses are there? There's one. There's just one witness. You've got one guy saying, I discovered these spiritual truths that I want to share with you. You've got one guy who said, an angel visited me. You've got one guy who said, I spoke with God, and this is how you need to live your life. Not so with the claims of Jesus. How many witnesses saw Jesus alive? Over 500. 500. Have you ever played that telephone game before? Where you could just have 20, 30 people in a line and you tell somebody a message and they got to repeat it and it gets passed down. By the end, that message doesn't look anything like the original one, does it? But that's the point that Paul makes in 1 Corinthians 15. If you go, because some of these people, some of these Corinthian brothers, they were struggling. He says, go interview them. That's the point that he's making. He says, some of them have died, because this is written 20 years after the crucifixion, is 1 Corinthians. He's saying, some of these brothers have died. Most of them are still alive. Go talk to them. He's already told them their names. Go, if you have any doubts, go interview them. And they will all have different angles. They will all have different perspectives, but it's all the same story. The story hasn't changed. Jesus rose from the dead, and you can bank your life on it. You can stake your entire life on it. That's the point that Paul's making. Now, what are the odds that these 500 people would get together, fabricate a story, stick to that story under threat of torture and death? I mean, what are the odds of that? You know, what are the odds that, they'd get together and make up this story, and then they get arrested, and they're given the opportunity, okay, recant the story, or we're going to torture you and put you to death. Not one person changed their story. Not one witness changed their story. They said, I will die, I will be tortured. But it's the truth that Jesus rose from the dead, and they died for it. If one witness had changed their story, all of Christianity would have unraveled. The whole movement would have fallen apart. But not one witness changed their story. They all went to their graves, holding on to the truth, proclaiming the truth. Jesus really rose from the dead. Now, some people want to say that they were lying. But if they were lying, why? What would be their motivation to lie? Some people say, well, maybe they were trying to get rich off of it. Well, where's the evidence for that? Where's the evidence they got rich from it? There is none. I mean, you look at what Paul wrote. Paul wrote to the Corinthians. Paul says, I don't want your money. Paul wrote to the Thessalonians, I worked night and day so that I would not be a financial burden to you. He said, I could have taken your money. That's my right as an apostle, but I didn't want to. I don't want your money. I want your hearts. I want your love. So he accepted money from the Philippians to do the ministry in other places, but the other churches, he said, I never took your money because I don't want it. There's no evidence that anybody got rich. In fact, Paul says that was part of the problem with the Corinthians, is Paul looked so wretched and poor. He was very unimpressive, and they're like, I don't want to be like that. But Paul says that's the mark of a true apostle, is this poverty that we're living in. So no one could accuse the apostles of getting rich off of it. They didn't. None of them grew a harem like Solomon. There's no evidence there for that. Well, what about power? Were they after power? Well, again, look at the life of Paul. If Paul was hungry for power, he made a big mistake becoming a Christian. Because he had a lot of power before he was a Christian. Paul was a rising star in first century Judaism. He was a Pharisee directly under the Pharisee, I'm going to butcher his name, but Gamaliel. And Gamaliel was in the Sanhedrin. He was one of the most powerful, influential Pharisees in the entire first century. And Paul was directly under him. Paul was in line to inherit all of that authority, all of that power. If you think about it, Paul presided over the execution of Stephen. That was a position of authority. And when the chief priests and the Sanhedrin, they said, we need to send somebody to hunt down Christians in other countries, who did they go to? They went to Paul. They appointed Paul as a special counsel to go hunt down Christians. You could make the argument before his conversion that Paul was power hungry, maybe money hungry, but he threw it away. He threw all of that power, all of that authority away. He gave it up. Why? There's only one thing that makes sense. And Paul would say, it's because I met Jesus. I saw the resurrected Jesus. That's the only answer that actually makes sense for any of these guys. Why they did what they did. Why they changed their lives. Why they would risk their lives the way they did. Now, one thing that I want us to consider, and we're going to end with this, and this may be new information, it may not, I don't know. But is Jesus the only Jew in the first century who claimed to be the Messiah? The answer is no. There's actually quite a few. I don't know the exact number, but I think it's around 50 or 60 men in the first century, Jews who claimed to be the Messiah. And you might think, well, that's kind of weird, right? Why? Well, it's Daniel's fault. The prophet Daniel, it's his fault. He said there's going to be 77s, which the Jews interpreted as 490 years. In 490 years, the Messiah is going to come. And the Jews living around the time of Jesus, they did their calculations. They're like, I think this is now. And the thing is Jesus actually confirmed it. Now is the time that Daniel was talking about. He quotes that. The abomination that causes desolation, he's quoting that part of Daniel. He says, Daniel was correct. It's happening right now in this generation. So it's Daniel's fault. But we know of a few really famous ones. So in the year 6, there was a guy named Judas from Galilee who started a revolution against Rome. Guess what happened to him? The Romans killed him. This is actually referenced in the book of Acts. I think it's Gamaliel is actually the one telling the story in the book of Acts. So Judas killed by the Romans, his movement crushed. After Judas died, did anybody say that he was the Messiah? No. Not one person after his death said, you know what? I think he's still the Messiah. Why? Because you can't have a dead Messiah. The Messiah has to be alive. The Messiah cannot be dead. Otherwise, he's not the Messiah. Every Jew knew that. That's part of the requirements, is to be alive, reigning over God's kingdom. So you can't have a dead Messiah. To be dead is the first indication you were never actually the Messiah. Okay? Well, there's a revolt that happened that Jesus predicted. Jesus predicted this revolt to happen in the 60s. Simon Bar Giora. I have no idea if I'm saying that correctly. Simon Bar Giora led a revolt in the 60s. It was so devastating to Rome, they sent their legions down to crush it. They cornered him in the city. They trapped him in the city of Jerusalem. Then, as Jesus predicted, they destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. This happened in the year 70. So after 70, did anybody say that Simon was the Messiah? Nope, because he was dead. You can't be the Messiah if you're dead. The last one was in the 130s. In the 130s, Bar Kokhba he led a revolt against Rome. Was pretty successful for quite a few years. And then the emperor sent his legions down and crushed the movement, destroyed the whole movement. In fact, kicked all of the Jews out of Judea. It was illegal for them to even live in that area after that. It was such a bad revolt. Did anybody say that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah after 135? No, because he was dead. I'm saying all this. Why would Jews in the first century say that Jesus was the Messiah when everybody knew that he had been crucified? Well, you have to have three things. The testimony that he was crucified and he was dead. The second is that there was an empty tomb. And then the third thing is They met and spent time with a man who demonstrated himself to be the crucified Jesus, but also was different. He had changed. He had been transformed from mortality to immortality, and that was a little weird for them. But the point is, if there's no empty tomb, then you could say, well, they were hallucinating, they saw his ghost, whatever. But there's an empty tomb. If there's an empty tomb but no meetings with Jesus, you say, well, somebody stole his body. But there's an empty tomb. They met with Jesus. They spent time with him. They ate with him. They touched him. Those things together are the only explanations of why these people completely reordered their lives, risked their lives, and why Christianity began. There's really no other explanation for why Christianity got started, why it spread like wildfire throughout the world. There's no other explanation. People, you can look at the evidence and say, well, I just don't want to believe. And that's the right that God gives you, that freedom to make that choice. But the evidence is there. Now we haven't looked at the Gospels very much, have we, today? So we're going to do that next week. We're going to continue this on. Next week, we're going to look more at some of the specific stories in the Gospels that help us to see that these stories are not made up. These stories are real and they're early, because some people will say, well, they were written down 100 years, 200 years later. We're going to see that these stories are very early. They were written down pretty quick. So we'll go on to that next week.